Coming up, I show every step to install an intercooler on a Supercharged 3800 Fiero, also including a phenolic spacer, relocating the intake air temperature sensor, and plugging the intake coolant ports. Don't forget to thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll answer any questions in the comments. This is a ZZ Performance full stack intercooler kit. All of these parts can be found in the build thread intercooling section or in the video description. The kit, it comes with the dual pass heat exchanger and the higher flow intercooler pump. Usually on their website it's a couple $100 off on Black Friday. The whole reason for changing out your intercooler is so that you can run a smaller pulley, or you can advance your ignition timing in order to increase the power output of your engine. With no other modifications, ZZP says that you can run a 3.0 inch pulley with this intercooler installed. That might be able to gain you about 60 to 70 horsepower over the factory setup. You must replace the stock fuel rails because they're going to be too short to fit over this new intercooler. Check out the Build 2 Fuel section, linked in the description. It also includes E85 conversion, so I'm putting an extra 1/4 inch phenolic spacer underneath it. You will have to get a few extra longer bolts. That will prevent this intercooler from soaking up heat and conducting it to the supercharger. You have to buy this intercooler filler neck separately. I'm going to tap the intake manifold and put an additional intake air temperature sensor. This will help me tell if I'm approaching dangerous detonation levels of intake air temperature after the supercharger. I'll switch back to my regular one while in normal operation. I'm also going to plug the holes that deliver coolant to the throttle body through the intake manifold. While I'm at it, I'm also going to add some polished aluminum valve covers from ZZ Performance. Intercooler is 2.5 inches extra height. You will have to trim a notch out of your Fiero decklid in order for the Fiero decklid to clear the supercharger snout. First, open your trunk and we're going to remove your panels. In my original install, I mounted my coil pack to the firewall and I'm going to be relocating it. There's just too much congestion in this area now and I want to run the intercooler hose through it. First, get your supercharger belt taken off. Put a 15mm wrench around the tensioner pulley, relieve the spring pressure by torquing on it, and then remove the belt. I'm going to disconnect my fuel rail. Mine is custom. On a stock fuel rail, you'll have to pop off some retainers on each fuel injector. I want to relieve the fuel pressure first. Usually there's a pressure port that you can press. It might spray some fuel out, so be careful. Also need a quick release fuel rail tool in order to get the stock connectors off. Then I pop off my intake to get it out of the way for this process. Go ahead and unhook your intake air temperature sensor, your mass airflow sensor, your throttle cable, and your throttle position sensor, your idle air control valve. Also take off the vacuum ports on the top of the supercharger, and your MAP or your manifold air pressure sensor. And just loosen up all the supercharger bolts and the supercharger should lift right off. I have an old phenolic spacer that can come off too. Vacuum out any debris that's accumulated in the engine bay. For the time being, you might want to tape over your intake so you don't drop anything down there. Keep the fuel injectors in the holes so that you don't drop anything down in there. I disconnect the wiring harness on all the fuel injectors. Since everything is all clean and together right now, I'm just going to change out the valve covers. You might want to take the valve covers off in order to clean out the inside of the heads under the covers. Before reassembling anything, make sure that the surfaces are clean. Clean off the old gaskets or buy some new gaskets. If you've ever used that high mileage additive, you're going to have to replace these gaskets because they swell up too big. Make sure the valve covers are back on before doing any other work. Torque the valve cover to 89 inch-pounds, starting in the middle and spiraling outwards. Now it's time to remove the lower intake manifold so we can do some of the work to it on my workbench. You might be able to get away with not removing this. Skip to this time on the video if you're not taking off your intake manifold to modify it. Before proceeding any further, now is the time to drain the coolant. Just open up the valve on the back of the radiator with a pan underneath. We want to drain it just enough to get the intake manifold empty. The coolant elbow that I have has a retainer bracket keeping it in. Because I do not have the alternator in the original location, you'll have to remove the alternator cooling circuit or these coolant elbows sticking out of the front of the intake manifold. You'll also have to remove the thermostat housing bolts. You must unplug the coolant temperature sensor right underneath the thermostat as well. You might want to vacuum it up and clean it out. Pull the intake manifold up evenly and do not tip it over, causing it to drain out coolant into your engine. Stuff a paper towel or tape over the lifter valley so you don't drop anything else down there. Then you also might want to plug every hole with a paper towel into your intake ports I had to clean up this RTV from the old intake manifold gaskets. Found this little surprise safety Torx screw inside my intake, but it could have easily gone into a cylinder. Now is the fun part, and we get to scrape off some gasket material from the rest of the intake. You have to plug the coolant passages on this because the intercooler does not have holes for the coolant passages to go to the throttle bot. I turned the intake upside down so that gravity helps with cleaning this thing out, and I'm going to wire brush the old JB weld out of this hole. I'm also going to drill these holes upside down so, again, it stays clean and the shavings don't fall into the intake. You might want to do a drill press on this instead. Use a 7/16 inch drill bit for a 1/4 inch NPT tap. Then grease up a tap and slowly and firmly work it down into the aluminum while keeping it as straight as possible. I had to go down almost all the way on this tap. Don't go too far though, not all the way. Now we're going to thread the plugs in. First, go ahead and coat them in this NPT Teflon tape. You want to tighten the thread into the tape. Look at the plug and turn the plug clockwise in order to tighten it, or the tape counterclockwise around the plug. You want these plugs to be very tight. Make sure that they are down far enough that they do not protrude above the gasket surface, or else they will interfere with the intercooler. The two holes for the coolant flow actually increase the coolant returning back to the water pump. They're now blocked off, so it might be a good idea to open up an equal-sized hole to maintain the same volume of water returning back to the water pump. I took off this little cover here and ground a notch that's about the same size of those holes with the coolant ports. There are not that many locations to tap a hole for the intake air temperature sensor. I want mine to be removable and accessible when the engine is in the car, so I'm going to pick the spot in the valley over here. Notice how the phenolic spacer or the intercooler or gasket will actually interfere with the sensor if I put it here. So I'm going to have to shave down the spacer and the gasket a little bit. Here I just took an egg-shaped carbide bit. I need to shave it down just enough so that I can fit my 3/4 inch socket wrench in here in order to loosen and tighten this thing when it's in the car. Put the bolt that belongs in this intake manifold hole back in just so you know that you're not going to interfere with it later. Then while that phenolic spacer is sitting on top of the intake manifold where it will be installed, I stick that socket in there and see where the sensor will line up. That's exactly where I need to drill and tap this hole. You can try jerry-rigging up a screwdriver to go through the back of the socket. As long as it's centered, you should be able to punch the back of the screwdriver and make a little indent exactly where that hole needs to be. And then mark that indent with a Sharpie. Take your time on this process. Also here, I'm going to mark with a Sharpie the angle that I need to tap this hole at. I will try to keep this lined up best I can. Then turn on a vacuum and go ahead and drill out that hole through the intake manifold. You need a 37/64 inch drill bit for this 3/8 inch NPT fitting. Step up and drill bit size very slowly, only one at a time. Same idea here, grease the tap and very slowly and very carefully thread this tap in. Go ahead and clean off your intake as thoroughly as possible. Make sure there are no metal shavings left in any of the coolant passages or in the intake manifold. Then make sure you clean off all of your intake bolts very thoroughly. They have some sort of a Teflon-based sealant on them, I'm guessing, but if you just scrub it with a wire brush, it does come off. Now it's time to reinstall the lower intake manifold. Make sure that there's no leftover Teflon sealant in the bolt holes or that fell down into underneath the valve covers. If there was, then clean it all out. Get your new air intake gasket set out, and there should be 2 long rubber gaskets. Those go on the ends of the lifter valleys here. You're going to want to dab some sealant on both the bottoms and the tops of the corners of the lifter valleys where these gaskets should run into. I would use ultra gray here because ultra black is very difficult to clean up. Once you set the intake manifold down in there, start threading in each of the bolts. Almost all of these bolts in the intake manifold protrude into an oil passage, so we're going to put some more Teflon sealant on these things. I'm going to torque them in this sequence to 5 and then 8 and then finally to 11 foot-pounds. Now, before you forget, plug in the coolant temperature sensor again and then reinstall the thermostat housing. Once everything is in, I'm going to actually install and tighten down that new intake air temperature sensor. Reinstall that coolant elbow. Now I'm going to line up this phenolic spacer and make sure everything fits up really good before installing everything. I'm glad I checked this because the holes on this thing are drilled very inaccurately. I had to widen 3 different holes on this thing in order to make it fit. I probably should have also ported the air intake hole because it didn't line up exactly right. This is odd to me because my 1-inch spacer from earlier that I took off was actually very good. I've also heard these things have a chance of not being very flat, but thankfully mine is and it seals up good. If you want to keep these Garlock gaskets that come with the kit, then it's kind of nice to trace around these things and cut them so that you don't see that ugly green gasket sitting underneath your intercooler. Later, I decided to just order some metal gaskets instead. Before reinstalling the supercharger, we're going to have to scrape off the old gasket from the bottom. Now I'm going to line everything up and test fit it. You're going to need a gasket, and then the phenolic spacer, and then another gasket, and then the intercooler, another gasket, and then the supercharger, for a total of 3 gaskets sandwiched in between here. That's a lot of things to line up. The supercharger and the intake manifold used to have dowel pins holding them together. I'm actually going to make myself some new ones, put in between every single layer, so that I maintain alignment while trying to put it together. Menards has a pretty good selection of dowel pins that you can grab. Just take one out of your old intake manifold, take it over to Menards, and see if you can find one that's similar. In order to fit the dowel pins into the intercooler, you have to drill out the specific bolt holes that the dowel pins were in on the lower intake manifold. You only have to widen them slightly and drill about a 1/4 inch deep or less. So since I have a 1/4 inch phenolic space underneath here, the bolts that came with the ZZ Performance kit are not going to be long enough. You can easily buy all but 3 of these bolts that are about a 1/4 inch longer to support the 1/4 inch phenolic spacer. However, 3 of the bolts you really can't find a good size close. So instead, what you can do is buy a threaded rod and cut it to length, and then put a nut on the top. Before cutting out the threaded rod, you might want to thread a nut onto it, and then while it's still warm from the cut, back the nut off to reshape the threads. Thread it on and off enough times so that it's not difficult to get started anymore. I'm not going to torque it down quite yet because I want to be able to take the supercharger on and off several times in order to check the fitment of my hoses. Since this is a Fiero, I'm going to get 2 right angle molded rubber hoses, one longer than the other, and point them towards the firewall of the car. I'm also going to get barb fittings to mate with the hoses that run up to the heat exchanger at the front of the car. I'm also going to stick my filler neck right around here because this is the highest point on the intercooler system, which will be ideal for filling from. I'm going to treat this as an overflow tank as well. Now I've got to figure out where to mount the intercooler's heat exchanger. It's basically just another big radiator. I'm looking underneath the GT Fiero Aero nose, and it looks like there's a perfect amount of space down here. I'm going to have to take off these Aero nose seals in order to get it crammed in here. I'm going to have to come up with a custom mounting solution for these things. I'm going to just pen and paper some bracket designs real quick here, and then just cut out some brackets out of some sheet steel. I'm going to use my vise and a hammer to bend the sheet steel into place. This is what I came up with. The Fiero bumper does have some pre-drilled holes. I got 2 10mm bolts and I stuck a magnet to them and was able to get the bolts threaded through these holes to hang these brackets from. I got the dual pass heat exchanger, that way my coolant hoses are going to go to the same side of the heat exchanger. It seems to me like the dual pass is also going to cool off a little bit better because there's a longer tube through the dual pass heat exchanger. Reinstall your radiator seal on this side and then go ahead and mark the spots where the holes are on the dual pass heat exchanger. Then go ahead and cut them out with a hole saw. Then reinstall the seal on the other side. I got some right angle fittings. These things are brass and you should probably put some Teflon tape on them. Make sure that they are torqued very tightly. You obviously can't torque them to a specific torque, so just torque them really tight and then angle them straight back. Then you're going to need about 30 feet for the Fiero of hose. If you don't have a Fiero, the intercooler kit already comes with an adequate amount of hose length. I would recommend not cutting until you make your own measurements and decide on your own routing. Grab some hose, link in the description, and stretch it out, mark it, and make the cut. Make sure to measure twice. I was able to route mine underneath the car the whole way, some through parts of the chassis, and it meets up with the coolant line on the passenger side of the car. It follows that all the way back until it hits the firewall, and then that's where I mounted the pump. The pump has basically a 90-degree difference between the inlet and the outlet. I decided to use a pre-existing hole in the frame, which I had a perfect size long screw for. I needed a way to offset the pump from the frame, so I cut out a custom length rod and then put the screw through it. Then cut and hook up the hose. Then zip tie everything up so that it doesn't interfere with the belt. Grab some vice grips and you can use a big razor edge like what I've got here to cut this hose pretty easily and mark it where we're going to need to cut it. You want the overfill tube right above the pump, and you want the pump driving water in the direction of the heat exchanger through the bottom, and then you want the return coming back to the top. Here's all the hosing all hooked up. Torque all of the bolts in this sequence to 17 foot-pounds. I decided to do it in 3 even steps. At this point, you can probably fill it back up with coolant. Later on, I'm going to run the engine and get it warm enough so that the thermostat opens up and pushes all the air out of the system while I'm continuing to fill it. If you've got an air intake like mine, then you've got to get at least a 45-degree elbow on here and kind of relocate the mass airflow sensor. This elbow is going to work great, but I'm going to have to cut it down so that it'll clear the deck lid of the Fiero. I'm still using the Spectre air intake. It's a crinkle style that is flexible and can pretty much be routed wherever I need it to. This thing is so versatile, I've just left it in here over the years. If you did unhook the mass airflow sensor, then you can go ahead and hook it back up. Now you can also hook back up your idle air control valve, your intake air temperature, with possibly your extension harness to the relocated spot, and your throttle position sensor, and the throttle cable. Don't forget the vacuum ports on the top of the Supercharger. Because my custom fuel rail runs over the Supercharger, now I've got to extend its length since I just raised the Supercharger. I had some leftover fuel hose, and I just cut it to custom length. These fittings are pretty tough to get out. You might have to cut them out. It does help to get a heat gun and then grab them with a heat resistance glove in order to pull them out and reuse them. You also might want to use a heat gun in order to heat up the hose to push the fittings into the new one. Next, onto the electrical connection for the pump. ZZ Performance includes some instructions, but I don't really like how they did it. I would prefer to have my pump on a switch so that I can control it myself. Here's a quick diagram on how this system is set up. You're going to have to do something custom anyways because you only are given a flying lead connector to the pump. The Fiero fuse box has a ignition voltage pin on it that you can pull off of. I would put a 10 amp fuse on this. Then all I did was wire the 12 volt pin to a toggle switch that I've got. I put the toggle switch underneath the dash, and then I brought it all the way back through the firewall of the car to a relay. I cut custom length wire and then stripped the ends, and then in order to extend the wires, I braided them together, and then I soldered them, and then I slid some heat shrink over them and hit them with a heat gun. And then I crimped on some spade terminal connectors that will connect to the relay, and some ring terminal connectors that will connect to battery ground and battery positive. I also put a 10 amp fuse between the battery power and the relay. I grounded the relay directly to ground for the signal pins, and then I hooked the relay up to the switch that I have in the dash on the positive, and I hooked the power pin on the relay directly up to the battery. I then found another existing hole in the frame, and I screwed the relay into the frame and then hot glued all of the wired connections to the relay so they don't come loose. Then just make all the hose connections with plenty of hose clamps. Now we're going to key on, but not ignition on, and then fix the inevitable fuel leak. And it's time to start filling coolant. Because the pump is on a switch, I can just turn the ignition key on and then turn the switch on, and the pump will run while the car is not running. I started using the coolant filler reservoir at the top, just pour in coolant very slowly, and then check for the hose clamp that you forgot to tighten down. You might want to toggle the pump on and off a few times to get the coolant kind of cycling through the system first. Once you've got enough coolant in there and it's flowing through, just leave the pump on for 10 to 20 minutes and just continue to slowly fill that while it vents all the air out of the system through this top reservoir. If you overfill, you can use a baster or this antifreeze tester to siphon some out. Now's a good time to change out this pulley. I'm running a 2.7 inch pulley because I have the internals such as a camshaft that will support that. It's also an 8 rib pulley because I have an overdrive balancer. You can see that video on my YouTube channel. Install your new belt. You might have to go a couple sizes down. At this point, everything moving forward is custom on the Fiero. If you have Rodney Dickman's dual strut kit, the strut on the passenger side of the car will not fit any longer. Rodney still has a vertical hinge-mounted strut kit available. I actually decided to buy 2 of these, and I got 2 custom shocks that of different lengths than from what come in his kit. The reason is, on the driver's side, this kit was made to go to the same mount hole where the other strut kit is from, but obviously that's not going to work. On the other side, however, you still have to use the middle hole because later we're going to have to cut off the hole on the end in order to notch out the part of the deck lid. You have to use the center hole in the hinges with a brand new M6x1x15 bolt. Now it's time to cut a notch out for the Supercharger snout. The Supercharger snout is a little bit too high now and it interferes with the Fiero deck lid. Cutting this notch out, we'll have to cut into some of the metal hinge that also holds up the deck lid over here. I cut as little of this as possible off, and I kept the 2 holes towards the middle and the rear of the hinge. I cut about 1.5 inches to 2 inches deep into the deck lid. Be really careful here because there is a harness that runs through this area in order to actuate the trunk lock. You don't want to cut into this harness and have to do some splicing on it. Once you get a small hole, you might want to look for the harness and see if you can tell where it is so you can avoid cutting into it later. Once you notch out the fiberglass, you're going to have to cut out the inner steel support as well. If you remember from earlier, I'm relocating my coil pack. I think I like this area. Thankfully, my harness can extend this way. I'm going to use the dog bone mount hole in order to mount this thing here. I've actually got a second coil pack bracket, and this is going to give me the perfect spacing for doing it this way. I need to thread the bolt for the dog bone through a mount somehow. And if I just mark this bolt here, and then punch and drill out a new hole for the bolt to go through. All I have to do is grind down the head of a bolt a little bit in order to fit this bolt in between these two coil pack mounts. You will have to get a pretty thin wrench in here in order to fasten it down, but this thing mounted up really good. I had an issue with the throttle cable being a little bit short, getting around my new intake setup and the higher supercharger. The cable gets pulled too tight by this steel catch on the end of the throttle, and it pops off this little plastic throttle retainer piece. This can actually cause the throttle to get stuck slightly open. So I took off the throttle body and I taped over the whole thing in order to keep it clean. Then I just marked an X on this and I notched out a little bit of that little metal catch right there. Pried it off, filed it down smooth so it doesn't wear out my steel line, and that actually seemed to fix the problem perfectly. Now that everything is hooked up, go ahead and turn your engine on, let it warm up, and burn off all the coolant that you spill all over the engine to make sure that you have oil pressure. And that concludes this video on your intercooler. Then you're probably going to want to adjust your timing and take it out for a tune. I'll cover that in a future video. So be sure to thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I will answer any other questions in the comments.